Friends, let us understand a bit about climate justice. Uh, there are two ways of looking at climate justice, and those ways are represented by two groups of countries. One is the industrialized world, and other is the developing world. So let me first put the perspective of climate justice from the viewpoint of those who are at the other end of the receiving end, I would say, of the climate change problems. So this is better summed up. The climate justice viewpoint is better summed up by one statement which was stated by Mary Robinson, where she says that the issue of climate justice is beyond curtailing the uh, emissions. Okay, and what it says is the statement says that climate justice is about the shift from a discourse on greenhouse gases and melting of the ice caps into a civil rights movement. So rather than talking about only the greenhouse gases and the effects like melting of ice caps, let us start talking about the civil rights movement with the people and communities who are most vulnerable to the impacts of the climate change. So it is not simply a technical issue. Climate justice is a ethical issue, and hence we should not simply talk about the emissions and its effect, but it should talk about on whom the effects are, who is going to be impacted, and what are their rights. Okay, so this is what is called as the climate justice. Another way of understanding climate justice is from the equitable approach, which we were looking in our previous lecture. Uh, what is the equitable approach towards decarbonization? Uh, as we discussed with the help of a lot of data, uh, it is about fixing the responsibility. Okay. Uh, what it says is while everyone must do their part to address the climate change, so all the developed world as well as the developing world, they should contribute to address the problem of climate change by cutting down their emissions. However, the burden should not be borne by those that have contributed the least. And who has contributed the least, we had already seen by looking at the data. So the world's richest 10% of the people who are responsible for 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and the poorest 50% are only responsible for 10% of the emissions. So that is how we need to look at the issue, right? The other way of looking at climate justice is simply do not talk about uh, the present economic system. We need to talk about an alternative economic system which prioritizes profit over sustainability. Okay, so within the capitalist framework, if we remain the capitalist framework wherein there is everything is done, all the activities are done only for profit. If we can think of a system, an alternative system, which prioritizes profit over sustainability, then that is what is climate justice. So, climate justice in a way talks about a system change. We would need solutions which are transformative, uh, systems lens and approach. We will have that kind of approach, a very total approach, I would say. Uh, the issue of climate justice cannot be delinked from development, and if we talk about development, that development has to be all inclusive. It has to have a human rights based approach. Okay, so talking about climate justice is essentially talking about human development. So we cannot say that the people should be denied the right to develop. Okay, uh, and we should not say that those who are developed, they are developed. So what we need to take a very inclusive kind of stand, and that is what is climate justice. Another way of looking at climate justice is the way the climate justice is managed, the climate change is managed. So it would mean having a people-centered approach in managing the climate change. What it means is that the people who take decision to curb climate change, and those are the people who are ensuring representation, who are most vulnerable. So those who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, they should be given representation, they should be included, and their rights should be protected. Solutions must promote equity, they should assure access to basic resources, and they should ensure that young people can live, learn, play, and work in healthy and clean environments. Essentially, when you talk about climate justice, we should talk about money, and that money terms is another way of framing the climate justice talk. So, what it means is we start talking about climate debt and climate finance. So, what it means is significant costs are likely to fall on nations that lack funds to spend on, say, erecting wind turbines or building flood defenses. Much of this climate justice narrative centers around the need for wealthy countries to pay for these things. Okay, so what it means is that climate justice movement would talk about industrialized countries which are most polluting, the corporations which are most polluting, and they owe climate debt uh, towards the global south. So this is the way of looking at climate justice from a climate debt angle. So the developed countries or industrialized countries, they owe a debt towards the people from the global south. This is what is climate justice. And finally, climate justice viewpoint is about rights, and it's not about begging. So what Bolivian negotiator says is, when we are asking, what we are asking in terms of climate justice is repayment. We are not begging for aid. So we are not looking for aid. We are looking for rights. We want the developed countries to comply with their obligation and pay their debt. Okay, so this is the equitable approach towards decarbonization, where the scale and timing of emission reductions by the Annex 1 countries. Annex 1 countries means the industrialized countries. That should be sufficient to ensure that the debt is paid off. Okay, the climate debt of the developed countries towards the developing countries is paid off, and that debt has accumulated because of excessive past consumption of environmental space, as was discussed in the previous lectures, and their continuing excessive per capita emissions, which they still go on emitting a lot, is fully paid to developing countries. Okay, so this is what is climate justice viewpoint. Okay,